Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Adweek webinar, which is covering to podcast or not to podcast. And really what we're looking at is how your business can leverage the power of this, I don't want to call it emerging, but emergent format today. And today's webinar is being sponsored by Oracle NetSuite. I'm Stuart File, Custom Publishing Director of Adweek, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'm just going to take a few minutes to make sure that everyone knows what to expect from today's presentation and is also familiar with the various features of our webinar platform. Our presentation today should go somewhere in the 30-minute range. Afterwards, we're going to have plenty of time for audience Q&A. So if at any point during today's presentation you have a question for our speaker, just simply use the question tool on the left side of your screen, and we're going to get to as many audience questions as we can during the Q&A portion. We are supporting social sharing on today's webinar, and you'll see the hashtag we're using there on the title slide, hashtag Power of Podcasting. So if you are out there on social, and I'm sure many of you are, hey, give us a shout out using that hashtag. Let us know you're in the room today. You got a dozen people sitting around in your conference room chowing down on sandwiches for a lunch and learn. Hey, take a picture, show us that. But more importantly, be part of the social conversation. We'll be sharing some of the findings from today's webinar from the Adweek Webinars Twitter feed, which is at AW Webinars. So be part of that social conversation. It is not too late to invite your colleagues to join us, and we'd love it if they would. About 15 minutes ago, everyone should have received a final reminder email from us, and in there you'll find a link over to our registration page today. Grab that link, share it with your colleagues. There's still time for them to register and join us live, but if they can't make it live, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand about an hour, give it an hour after the live event ends. So if you have to leave early, you can always return and check out that on-demand recording and certainly share it with your colleagues. We'll be alerting everyone with a link to the on-demand version. Check your email about 3:30, 4 o'clock Eastern time today. You'll get that link from us. A couple other little things I just want to cover here for a minute after I'm done coughing. But yeah, a couple other things. So in top of your screen, you'll see the Event Resources tab. In there, you'll find a PDF of today's slide presentation, so feel free to go in there and download it. Of course, you can share that with your colleagues as well, as this is about podcasts. If you are engaging with this on demand, in Event Resources, you will find an MP3 audio file of just the audio track of today's webinar. So couldn't have a more appropriate topic for that. If you download it, you can engage with this webinar as you might a podcast. So just another alternative for anybody out there. Finally, we always urge you to check out the Adweek webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars. You'll see what we've got coming up on our calendar, and also you'll get access to our archive of on-demand webinars that way, including several that have been done by our sponsor, Oracle NetSuite. But check that out. Sign up for something we've got coming up, some really great topics. We'll be doing 2 or 3 of these a week really through June. I was just looking at our calendar. So please definitely check that stuff out. So let's move on to today's webinar on podcasting. We've got 2 speakers today, so just briefly, we've got Evan Hebby. Evan's the industry marketing manager over at Oracle NetSuite, our sponsor today, and Evan's just going to come on in a couple minutes here and just give us just a 1-minute overview of NetSuite as our sponsor today. But our featured speaker, as you see there on the right, is Dan Granger, who's the CEO and founder of Oxford Road, which is a Los Angeles-based ad agency, really specializes in performance marketing, working with a lot of direct-to-consumer brands, among others. And Oxford Road really helps these fast-growth companies scale their efforts across a variety of platforms, including podcasts. radio, direct response TV, and others like that. And Dan has spoken on this on a number of different forums and really has a lot of interesting things to say about the opportunities in podcasting and really helping people understand, well, I listen to them, but is it for me as a business? We'll be also, here's just a brief agenda, what you'll be seeing. Dan will be covering Rise of the Podcast, and then that to podcast or not to podcast question, and then our Q&A time. So let me just pass this quickly over to Evan, just for a brief overview of NetSuite, and then on to Dan for today's presentation.
Thank you, Stuart. Hello, everyone. My name is Evan Hebe. As Stuart mentioned, I run industry marketing here at NetSuite for our service-based verticals, including service companies, including professional services consultants, advertisers, media companies, publishers, and software SaaS-based companies. So today, before we jumped into the conversation around to podcast or not to podcast with Dan, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on NetSuite. So NetSuite is one of the first cloud companies ever, and we were founded in 1999, and we had one mission: to create an accounting and business management software all in the cloud. We've never been an on-premise solution. We've never had hardware that you would install on site. It would always be an application that you'd log into over the internet, and you could be able to access anywhere, anytime, and see the real KPIs, metrics, and lifeblood of your business. Since then, a little company called Oracle acquired us in 2016 after NetSuite had gone public on its own in 2007. Once we were acquired in 2016, we hit record growth in our first full year under the Oracle umbrella. 2018, we grew our business significantly, and the most we've ever grown it since our inception. So with the acquisition by Oracle, NetSuite is continuing to grow. We're continuing to focus on our verticals and our go-to-market implementation for those verticals. So for advertisers on the line, media companies on the line, today you'll hear from Dan a little bit about his to podcast or not to podcast presentation. But if you're interested in learning more about business management software for your companies, please feel free to reach out to NetSuite. We have specific solutions for all of the industries I just mentioned. And with that, I won't bore you anymore with any of the NetSuite background and how great our solution is. I will pass it along to Dan for his presentation. Dan?
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Good to be here with everybody. I'll just start by thanking Adweek for providing a platform for this kind of conversation. I think it's important and wouldn't be possible without what you guys have provided here. And of course, NetSuite, not only am I a customer, but a lot of the brands we work with that have really have kind of gone from startup to category leader, they swear by it as well. So great solution. And kudos to you guys for what you've done with GrowWire, where you've kind of taken this subject about creating your own podcast and really going all in on content creation and providing a template for others on how to do that. So hats off to you guys. I'm glad to be here today. It was a bit of a close call for me. I managed to get pulled over as I was speeding into the office to get ready for this. So whenever I do a presentation of any kind, I try to write out all my notes, and then I get text-to-speech to read it to me as I'm driving, so I can just kind of bake it into my mind about what the points I want to hit are. And I'm driving, I'm getting off my exit, and I'm telling Siri to turn off voiceover with my phone in my hand, and a cop sees me and pulls me over. So, while voice is certainly changing the way that we do everything, it still has its limitations, and we're still working out some of the mechanics in real life. So I'm glad I could be here, glad we could get this done. I know a lot of you are in different stages of your business. I suspect most of you are podcast superfans, and what an exciting time and industry to be exploring right now. And I think, I've got some content for about 20 or 30 minutes we're going to run through, but I'm really looking forward to getting a chance to talk to you guys directly and hear, what it is that's most important to you. So without any further delays, let's get into the content. So before we talk about, what your best path is on how to leverage the opportunity that is in the podcast ecosystem, I think it's important that we all are on the same page about where the industry is, because it is a moving target. What podcast was and what made it famous is not exactly what it is today. And what it is today is not what it's going to be in a few years, because we're seeing such rapid change. And it's really been a boom town for creators and brands, but it is quickly becoming more corporate, a little more crowded, and it's going through a metamorphosis. And so if we really want to still leverage and harness the power that's available and the opportunity it represents, it's important that we do things now rather than later, so it doesn't pass us by. So step one here, I'm going to give you a jet tour of the history of how we got here to podcast as it is today, looking back at the history of audio over the last 100 years, and I'm going to try to zoom through that in about a couple of minutes. So buckle up and bear with me. In 1892, it was Tesla that proposed the transmission of radio frequency as a means of telecommunication. Then, of course, in 1904, the U.S. Patent Office reversed what they awarded to Tesla, and they credited Marconi with the invention of radio. Surprise, surprise, he was backed by none other than Thomas Edison, who you can see here recording his first podcast in 1907. So the industry starts taking off, audio's everywhere, and by the time we're in 1933, FDR launches his Fireside Chats. And I think this really connects all Americans with the medium, gives them an amount of trust, and really makes it legitimate as well as ubiquitous. From there, I'd say another major milestone was in 1938, when Orson Welles convinced America that we were being invaded by Martians, and we believed it. Now, the period of time, there's a bit of a wilderness period in terms of innovation. I'll say between 1938 and 2001, I'll sum it up and say that we had Casey Kasem. But then something happened, something interesting occurred around 2001, and that is that Adam Curry, known as the Podfather, the former MTV VJ, came down from on high, and with a few others, he started experimenting with audio on an RSS feed and bestowed upon us the first ever podcasts. Now, in 2004, the term podcast actually showed up in The Guardian, and now the industry had a name. And it was that same year that Pandora, or within a year, that Pandora started launching their Human Genome Project. Now, in 2005, things started to pick up a little bit. You had This Week in Tech with Leo Laporte. They won the People's Choice Award. We had George W. Bush giving his first weekly address delivered via podcast. And then this was actually really important. Apple integrated podcasts in their iTunes 4.9 software. Now, a couple other things start happening in audio after that. In 2006, you had Howard Stern leaving terrestrial radio for Sirius. And what was interesting about that is that you had somebody with a fixed audience, somebody that was in every market that had traditional media mass reach, start siphoning from that audience and bringing it to a new audio channel that people had never tried before. And it was at that time that me personally, I'm in the picture on the right in the middle. I went to New York City. I was working for Clear Channel at the time, what we now call iHeartRadio, and I accosted the Mays brothers, who were the CEO and CFO, and literally ranked as the most powerful men in radio. And I don't know, somebody took a picture of me doing the pitch. I said, guys, Pandora is going to change everything. Podcast is going to change everything. And our whole industry is about to be revolutionized. And I pitched them this whole plan. It was called like talkradio.com. And I said, we need to lead this change and not be victims of it. But, you know, alas, all the major radio companies at that time were kind of bogged down in a post-consolidation world. They had a lot of debt, and they had bigger fish to fry, and it really just wasn't a big enough opportunity yet. Plus, I don't think they liked my mutton chops, so they were like, "Thanks, kid, but go back to your desk, and we'll let you know when we're interested." So it was kind of that experience that a few years later led me to say, you know what, the radio industry is moving too slow, and I set out on my own to take advantage of the growth that was in podcasts, and that allowed us to be an agency for some really interesting direct-to-consumer brands, Dollar Shave Club, ZipRecruiter, Hulu, Blue Apron, and about 160 others. We got to help them go from startup that nobody's heard of to household names in many cases, and podcast was a major part of our secret sauce in doing that. Now, more broadly across the industry, in 2009, you had fledgling comedian and radio host Mark Maron, who had a radio show. Nobody listened to it. They couldn't sell it, and he was really struggling. He launched his WTF out of his garage, and what that showed was that podcasts could actually relaunch a career and give somebody a new life that they couldn't achieve through traditional media. That was really important. 2011, Adam Carolla gets the Guinness Book of World Record award for most downloaded podcast. And in 2013, Apple announces that there are 1 billion podcast subscriptions. So that's a lot of kind of how the infrastructure got put in place. And then the major shift that happened was in 2014 with the launch of Serial. Serial is when podcasts became mainstream. It started all geeks and comedians, and this really took it to another level. And now everybody knows about podcasts. Everybody's talking about podcasts. Everybody has a podcast. And 17 years after the first podcast ran, the revolution is over, which is where we are today, and the rebels have won. Podcast is a thing. It's not going anywhere. But there's a bit of a plot twist. And that is that the very industry that podcasts set out to disrupt is now kind of coming in the back door, and they want in on the action. And so we're at a critical point in our history. And I did a piece for The Drum last year to kind of announce my thesis, which is that radio is eating the podcast world. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that because I think it's important that you understand the dynamics across the ecosystem as you think about how to leverage it for yourself. So a couple developments that have happened in the last couple of years, you're seeing an acquisition spree. And, here's a few examples. The big shot across the bow was iHeartRadio or iHeartMedia. They're literally mid-bankruptcy, and they go, yeah, we'll just scoop up How Stuff Works networks for $55 million. And so this is like pocket change for them, and they picked off one of the top 10 networks in the whole industry. And then after that, you've got things like Hubbard Media investing in Podcast One, Entercom takes a 45% interest in Cadence 13, Scripps buys Midroll, and the whole dynamic changes. Now, you've also seen Sirius Radio buys up Pandora, and now Spotify's on a tear. So they start picking up players. You saw they spent like $230 million for Gimlet, added a few more to that, and now all of a sudden this thing is consolidating. Now, let's look at how this actually impacts the charts. So here's a PodTrack ranking from March of this year. And what's really interesting about this is if you look at the top 10 networks that are producing podcast content, how many of them are actually radio companies or in partnership with radio companies? So NPR, iHeartRadio, PRX, okay. Number 4, you've got Wondery, which is independent, even though it's backed by Chernin. Wondery just announced a partnership they're doing with Entercom, which, remember, Entercom is the number 2 radio broadcaster. So you go down the list, and everybody's got something. Another glaring exception would be the New York Times, not a radio company, but can we at least acknowledge that this is a print company founded in 1851, pre-Civil War? So the real takeaway here is that what's old is new, what's new is old, and the two worlds are really coming together. So you go, okay, fine, I accept your premise. What does that mean to me? And so let's look at a few predictions about what's going to happen in this period of time when it goes from, all these little kind of pirate radio vibey entities all starting to come in and be part of a real corporate infrastructure. A few things are going to happen. Number one, there's going to be a lot of chaos, okay? And, for those of us that have been operating in this field for a long time, it's like so many people are just starting to figure out the Wild West that it was, and now it gets turned upside down again, and all the rules are changing. And now you've got radio, sales, and programming leads starting to take over podcast groups. There's going to be a lot of confusion. The right hand's not always going to know what the left hand is doing. That being said, whenever there's some amount of instability, that can also be a good time for experimentation. And I would say some of the large players, I think they were a little bit humbled by the podcast industry, and I think that they're in a place where they're willing to listen, they're willing to try things, they want to support new ideas in a way that they weren't before. And I think the cement is still wet on some of that experimentation. In addition to that, one of the things that radio is going to bring to the industry that can be used to all of your advantages, that by partnering the old and the new establishment, they now have increased resources to promote content that they wouldn't have been able to before. When it was just a podcast going to other podcasts to promote, that wasn't as interesting. Radio still has much larger reach, and they've got 24/7 programming and thousands of spots that they can use to actually put a little bit more traction behind a show that otherwise might not get discovered based on its own merits. Okay, the second thing is radio imitates podcast, podcast imitates radio, right? So there's a piece of this that's kind of like when you see your parents or your grandparents showing up on Facebook. Some of that is starting to happen here. We're going to see podcasts, as they're getting more promotion and distribution, they're also going to be subject to some rules that maybe podcast wasn't before. A lot of the independents are going to be increasingly important. The entities that hold out and don't get sold in the near future, they're going to bring a bit of a counterbalance so that podcasts can stay cool and kind of set the bar so that the ones that have been acquired have accountability to not just start acting like radio and can continue to advance the things that we love about podcasts. And if you're a performance marketer, I think you're going to see response diminish a little bit because word is out and brands are flooding in. And then, consider this. In podcasts, when we got into the business, you might have a show that has 1 to 2 ads per hour. And when you deal with radio, they're packing like 18 minutes of ad units into an hour. Now, when the 18-minute group buys the 2-minute group, guess which side is going to win that tug of war? You're going to see things like talent fees, and you're going to see radio needing to kind of pick up the slack on revenue to recoup some of the investments that have been made. And then the third thing that's going to start happening is there's going to be a gold standard for measurement, and I think that that's kept the whole industry back from getting built out in a way that you might expect from a growing media channel. But when that happens, you're going to see things like actual targeting. You're going to see a lot more digital insertion than you've seen in the past. And, I believe that this idea that it's all live reads is going to start to go away. The live reads will be the exception, and you're going to start having clusters of spots that are produced and controlled, because when you can dynamically insert the ad units, you can control them, which makes it safe for big brands who don't want to just trust whatever Joe Rogan's going to riff on in his show, and that's going to be a lot more attractive to the bigger dollars. All of that just kind of showing that the marketplace is maturing at a very rapid pace. So in the future, I think that radio is going to be called radio, but it's going to actually start to evolve into more like a streaming version of radio, and it's going to be at full scale and ubiquitous, and podcast is going to be the on-demand version of audio entertainment. There's going to be a lot more evergreen content than we saw in the past, and that is like Netflix, and I think we'll meet the Netflix of podcasts, which everybody keeps talking about. By the way, for my money, I think that it's Spotify, and we can talk about that. So podcast is now entering a season of convergence and organization. It's going to be a lot of managed growth. And if you want to know my prediction for what the next revolution is, I think you need to look to the smart speaker. The fact that the speakers can now listen back to us and respond is something that we really haven't even scratched the surface on. Consider that when the iPod came out, it was basically a Walkman, and it wasn't brought out with the intent that the whole podcast ecosystem was going to emerge out of it, but that's what happened. And in the same way, we might have a smart speaker that we're just now using to, restock our toilet paper, but at some point this is going to revolutionize the way that we do audio content and entertainment. You're going to see true direct response because ads can be verbally interactive rather than all these silly promo codes and vanity URLs we still use. And you're going to see interactive content, so you can do more things like choose your own adventure. So as you're thinking about your long-term strategy for this type of industry, I want you to think less about your podcast strategy and more about your audio strategy, because the worlds are converging. So let's talk about what your options are. Because I think this is the central question. Now that we've kind of gotten a look at how did we get here and where is the industry today, let's talk about you and your brand and your kind of crossroads decision of, are we just going to be supporters as listeners and supporters as advertisers of this industry, or should we get in on the action of content creation? And I'm going to kind of give away the punchline up front, which is I think you've got two options. One is you either have the option to go big and throw in with a new establishment and kind of buy your way into it. And the second track is to go slow and steady and own by yourself a much, much smaller market. And so I'm going to take you through some of the thinking here, and then we'll revisit these thoughts. But look, to podcast or not to podcast, what's best for your business? Everybody in America that's paying attention in the last few years here has said, hey, maybe we should start our own podcast. And, I think the appeal is somewhat obvious. Podcasts are buzzy. Podcasts are exciting. Podcasts are the thing that everybody wants to be a part of. And the interesting thing about it is there's almost no barriers to entry. I mean, the idea that you don't need a camera and can do something so cool is really, really interesting, that you could actually make it on your phone. This was a narrative that I actually subscribed to personally before I started my ad agency, Oxford Road, in 2013. I wanted to get in from that angle, and so I started working with brands and business owners and executives to help them stake their claim in the modern day gold rush. And so, as an example, kind of like a really simple, basic version of like an anchor, we started handling production equipment, digital distribution. We brought in expert editors and producers and even sponsors, and everything that you would need to make a podcast successful, or so we thought. They all failed, and they failed for the same reason. And that is the same reason most new ventures fail, is people run out of energy, they run out of enthusiasm, and then the resources to push through the dip that it really takes to make somebody succeed. And so it's not that the talent was bad, it's just that they didn't have the time and energy to make it good, because they were busy focusing on running a successful business or a business unit. And so however much passion they had, eventually it went by the wayside. So that's why I turn my focus to my core competency, which is helping brands grow through a media vehicle, because it's a very different proposition to help a business be successful through advertising than it is through teaching them to become a media star. Okay, so back to you. How do you know if launching your own podcast makes sense? And you have to consider this, all right? There are 700,000 by the latest estimates different podcasts available on iTunes. 700,000. Now, experts tell me that the average podcast devotee has about 6 different podcasts a week that they listen to. And anecdotally, my perception, I haven't seen a report on this, but that the growth rate of new shows New shows that are being created is actually a lot faster than the growth rate of new listeners that are coming into the universe. That doesn't mean that it's not growing. I think this thing continues to get bigger and bigger, but there's just so much pressure with advertisers and shows flooding into the marketplace. And so, if you think the mattress companies have it bad in terms of, there being a million of them, think about how crowded your field is if you're going to create your own podcast. And so that means if you want to reach a new listener, you either have to get somebody to listen to your podcast who either A, has avoided the whole podcasting craze so far, or B, you have to steal a listener from somebody else's show. And shows, a lot of these are produced by the same people who make TV and movies. These are shows that are created by people who are professional entertainers, and they've committed their whole career in many cases to revolve around the podcast. So this is a big ask, especially if you're treating it as a side hustle. So the thing you have to ask yourself is, okay, what's my ultimate goal? And by what metric will you measure the success of your venture? And if you're thinking about doing this as a way to make money, forget it. That is probably the last motive that you should have. There's look, numbers are self-reported on revenue, but right now let's just say for argument's sake there's between 300 and 500 million in revenue for the whole U.S. podcast industry. That means that the average podcast is making less than $10 a week. And so you're better off driving an Uber, you're better off getting a paper route. The odds are not in your favor that this is going to be lucrative for you. And so that's not to discourage you. If you're not in it just to make money as a media conglomerate, there are still some very good reasons to start a podcast. And I want to walk you through some of those. So the first one is to build your Rolodex and industry relationships. One of the greatest benefits that a podcast gives you a platform. So you have your own show to invite people as guests. And that means that you don't just have a way to win the ears, hearts, and minds of your audience, but your guests do too. And so this gives you a chance to have meaningful conversations with people you might not otherwise have an excuse to talk to, or who may not make the time for you to talk. That's actually a very valuable asset for many businesses. Two, you can demonstrate expertise. Okay, if you're in the HVAC business, nobody really wants to hear your podcast about your thoughts on the president, however unique they may be. That said, if you take the time and energy to focus on your industry, do I want to listen to the HVAC podcast? Absolutely not. But the fact that you care enough to spend your time devoted to the subject because you're so passionate about it and so expert, this is a draw. This is a winning strategy. When you go into somebody's office and they have a degree hanging on the wall, an advanced degree, you don't necessarily want to read all their textbooks, but you like to know that they do. So I do think it's a credibility builder. And then the third thing is pure and simple love of the game. Okay, so even if you're good, if you're consistent, you're committed, the chance of your show becoming something that can have a life of its own, that you don't have to put money behind and actually makes money as a commercial enterprise, very, very small chances. But there's beauty in taking on this type of challenge, knowing that there may be no direct, immediate payback. So if you can set aside income and forget about building your Rolodex and ignore the perception of expertise, then I think you're really doing it for very pure reasons. And in effect, you have nothing to lose because you've got something to say, and the market will tell you if they want to hear it, but at least you can try and you can enjoy the process. And that may be the best part of the whole thing. It becomes about your passion. And so there you have it. If you're looking at it as an ROI tool, easier ways to make a living. If you're looking at it as a way to do it and not have to have it tied to an immediate KPI, absolutely this is a great thing to do, because the world does not need another podcast, but there's always room for a person with something to say on a subject where they have value to add. So, kind of bottom lining it here, for most of you, you should probably make audio part of your content marketing strategy, which is different than becoming a media company. And for some of you that have really meaningful resources and are really thinking big with this, you should consider investing and exploring partnerships with companies that already have meaningful audiences and promotional capabilities, because what you will find is, even if you do a good show, the idea that if you build it, they will come, very, very unlikely or very unrealistic that you'll be rewarded in kind for your effort. You have to do siphoning, the way that Howard Stern did moving audiences from one platform to another, or Dr. Phil, when he got his start, why did he get a show? Because he made himself known to Oprah's already existing audience. If you can parlay a relationship, whether earned or bought, and leverage that into getting people's attention, that's a lot easier, because audience discovery and adoption is very, very hard to achieve at scale. So a lot of content there. Excited to get into the Q&A, and with that, I'm going to throw it back to Stuart, and we can start taking some questions.
Great. Well, thank you, Dan. Really interesting topic, really fascinating topic, and certainly something I guess I was going to say on the minds of everyone, in the ears of everybody. But before we get into some Q&A, and we've got a whole bunch of questions queued up from the audience, a few quick reminders here. So number one, if you do have a question for Dan Granger, our guest speaker here, just simply use the question tool on the left side of your screen. We're going to get to as many audience questions as we can over the next 10, 15 minutes or so. We already had a few people asking this, so let me at least answer it now. If you want the slides, you will find a PDF of the slide deck in the Event Resources tab at the top of the screen, so feel free to download those, share them with your colleagues. Also, we did ask, people wanted to know, was this being recorded? How can I get it again? And the answer is yes, of course it was being recorded. And we will be notifying everyone who's registered with a link to the on-demand recording later today. So check your email about 3:30, 4 o'clock today. We'll send you that link. Feel free to share that with your colleagues, or just send them on over to register for it. They'll get a link on over, and once it's live, once they register, it'll be available right at that moment. So let's get to some of these questions, Dan, and I'm just going to tell you they fall into sort of two categories. Category one is, what do you do to actually put on that podcast, and category two is, what do you do to advertise and leverage all of this insight in podcasting. But let's talk first maybe about starting your own podcast. So if you're looking to do this and you want to get started, what would be that first step that you really should kick off to make sure you're going in the right direction?
So, good question, and like all good questions, it starts with an "it depends." But I think what everybody needs to do first and foremost is to really dig deep and ask yourself, why would I do this? What is my real goal? Because, look, here's what happens. You go into podcast and you're competing with two different verticals. You're competing with businesses that are there because they're trying to get customers, and they are using podcasts to acquire them in a more typical way through ad placement. And if you're not trying to acquire customers, and so that's tried and true. Anything you're trying to do, you're competing with them for every dollar in an industry that's not actually organized to support the same KPI. Now, on the second, the other side of the tightrope you have to walk is that now you're competing with other content creators who don't have a motive that's driven by a brand's specific interest. And so it's really, really hard to win a race when you're on a tightrope and you're competing with people who aren't on both sides. And so that's where I think the idea of, really doing some soul searching and asking yourself, what is my ultimate goal here? Is it to get new customers? Because there's much more proven ways to do that, such as advertising and podcasts, versus really trying to create content, a very competitive space.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as though everyone wants to sort of think. Again, you mentioned low barrier of entry, which is awfully dangerous to a lot of people because it doesn't involve ultimately their planning, right? If you're going to do a weekly podcast, well, then you need 50 different points of content over the course of a year, and that's a pretty big ask, isn't it?
It's a big ask, and then it's not even considering whether or not that content is good, right? Even
right.
to do it
Exactly.
badly is a big ask, right?
Yeah, well, that's and in the hundreds of thousands of podcasts that are out there, there are probably more that do it. Let's just say not well. I don't want to be. But let's move into some questions here, Dan, on also the advertising opportunities. So. When looking at so let's talk a little bit about looking at sponsorship, and obviously you've worked with people who are doing that. What should ultimately somebody look at in terms of audience targeting for podcasts, building out that ad strategy as they go forward? You mentioned about dynamic insertion of ads. Is that something we're going to be seeing? So what would be really, thinking maybe targeting first and audience targeting? How should an advertiser start to be thinking about that with podcasting?
Well, great question, and remember my bias here that I must disclose. My core business is an ad agency, so 9 times out of 10 when we take on a new engagement, it's because an advertiser wants to go into podcast, and they usually want to use it as a customer acquisition channel. And whether you work with a partner like us or whether you do it yourself, I believe that it is a three-legged stool upon which any solid acquisition strategy rests. And the 3 M's, which represent the legs of the stool, are media, measurement, and messaging. So what I mean by that is, media is the consideration of which shows you want to purchase and how much you pay and all that. Messaging is how do you structure the points that you're going to give to typically the show host. Dynamic insertion we'll set aside for a moment. But how do you know what to say in what sequence? And for example, at our agency, we have a process called Audiolytics that is predicated on every good ad should have 9 key components, and we also look at 71 subcomponents so that we can score an ad for its effectiveness and ability to drive performance. And then the third leg of the stool is measurement. And the most common things people are still doing for that are vanity URLs. And promo codes with special offers. That only gives you a slice of the whole response that you'll see, so you need to have some form of attribution to enhance your measurement to account for the sales that you make without direct a direct lens into it. You really have to triangulate. So that's the kind of strategic core. And happy to go deeper into any of those, including dynamic insertion, or if it's interesting, how do you choose the right shows to advertise on? That could be a question as well. But you tell me what's helpful.
Well, why don't we touch on each of those? I mean, I was actually going to say, are the days of look, we all listen to Serial. We all know MailChimp.
Yep.
We've all listened to WTF. We all know MailChimp. Although I guess that was also Adam and Eve. Am I going to entirely date myself by thinking like who would advertise on WTF? Are the days of actually doing something like that where that one podcast sponsorship is going to ultimately change perception of your brand? Are those days over, or is there still that opportunity of aligning yourself, finding the right context, finding the right personality, and really sort of going all in on a property, on a person, and building yourself out that way? Is that still possible?
I think it is less possible, somewhat possible, decreasingly possible. But look, we're seeing this across all mass reach channels. And what you also have to remember is that the podcast reach in aggregate is increasing, even though it is getting increasingly fragmented. But like, look at TV and Super Bowl numbers, right? We know what direction this is going, and it's not that people are consuming less of a medium. It's just that they're not all tuning into the same thing at the same time. So I think the fragmentation has made it harder to rest on one specific show to be your silver bullet. That being said, there are still, if you're a really small business, there are some shows that could be that for you. But like, you think about the brands that have, gone from startup to IPO. I think that podcast as a channel still has the potential to be the backbone of that kind of growth and demand generation. It's not going to be for everybody, but you can certainly look at companies worth over $1 billion that wouldn't trade their podcast exposure, past, present, and future, for the world.
Mm-hmm. Got it. A couple interesting questions. This is someone looking at leveraging podcasts, and you were talking obviously about the owned media side, and this is someone asking about the earned media side, right? Whether is that an opportunity for brands in this day and age to really be thinking, gee, I should be getting my executives on this podcast, or I should be getting myself told in this area. Are you seeing that as a logical extension for some brands as they go forward?
I don't think it's a particularly viable one. I do believe in PR. I have my own PR firm that I work with, but I don't see podcasts particularly being a simple strategy where you're going to be you're really going to become known among your target audience or customer base just because of those. I think that, those that are still kind of purist podcasters that have the most credibility are really protective of not sounding like they're selling out, although they are selling out in droves. But when you sell out and you buy your way in, there is a trade-off in terms of what is the real value of what you bought. So I think I think that, look, anybody that is soliciting interviews and exposure for earned media should consider podcast, but I don't see that as a particularly interesting. I think it's too narrow to build a whole growth strategy on that, and I don't yet know of anybody that's done it successfully.
Mm-hmm. So let's extend that into the area of sort of your audio strategy, right, as you were sort of covering in here as well. And this was somebody asking, and I thought this was interesting, in which they feel like they have what is more of a visual product. So is there a way, and maybe this goes back into the world of radio as well, but a way for someone who has something that is maybe that they think of as sort of more visual or tactile, ultimately taking advantage of just a simply listen to medium?
Great question. Everybody's always going to ask this till the end of time. And, in radio, the pat answer, which happens to be true, is that audio is theater of the mind, right? And if you think about all the visual products that people have purchased based on a personal recommendation, well, what was that personal recommendation? It was typically one person talking to another, which is the channel. I believe that the direct brand revolution, which is really the foundation on the backs with which the podcast ecosystem until now has been built, proves that people don't need to see or touch things to buy them. How on earth are we selling? How did we create a category leader out of Boll and Branch selling bed sheets to people that have never seen them in a store or touched them from recommendations being made on, by radio and podcast hosts? It's just, I don't think it holds true, although as you're generating that interest, they might want to go to a website and see the thing before they buy it, but that isn't always even as important as we think.
Yeah. You got it. So we've got a couple minutes left here, just some final reminders here to our audience. Obviously, we've got a whole bunch of questions here queued up, but if you do have a question for our speaker, just simply ask it. Again, we'll probably gather these and forward some stuff on as well if we don't get a chance to get to your questions. So another question here on planning. So, look, in any form of media, it is it's the angle that matters, right? There are only so many topics out there. So as someone's looking at this and looking at podcasting creatively, should they be thinking, well, I want to go on a broad topic or a narrow topic? Should I be going, deep on one thing, right? You use the HVAC person in terms of expertise, right? I mean, it would probably be useful if someone was doing a podcast on fixing your air conditioners. I mean, I guess maybe it's like YouTube that way. But as people are looking at things creatively, what would you recommend in sort of that broad, narrow, deep arena, and sort of the best way to maybe do some of that creative thought ahead of time?
So I'm going to address this from somebody that's thinking about advertising rather than content creation, and you tell me if you want the other.
Mm-hmm.
But the myth or the fallacy is that because it's emerging and because it's cool and because it's smart, that it's a targeting medium. And interestingly, it's actually not in the way you think. When you look at the 700,000 programs, it's more like 200 to 500 that are going to drive 80% of the reach and performance in for a brand, and those are generally not based on narrow topics. And so you might have a commercial real estate company, but if you only want to advertise on the commercial real estate podcasts, you may find that you get 3 customers out of the most aggressive campaign you can do based on that targeting, and it turns out it isn't even worth your time to pursue that. You're actually better off getting those customers from broad reach programs. And so I would treat it more like a reach medium. I do think that dynamic insertion is starting to change that. And I don't think we're not at the point of critical mass quite yet where I think you can do that at scale. But as they increase the ad loads, as more programs are able to provide precise information about audiences, you'll be able to do a little bit more targeting across a multitude of shows. But I don't think it's about my product is X, so I need shows that are only about X. That's not really how the brands that have been successful have used it.
Got it. So last question, I'm going to talk about, make it a content-related question, and that is, people got a few questions in here on people asking about, let's call it corporate podcasting, right? It's I work for a huge multinational conglomerate. Can we start to, produce our own podcast? So what is your thinking on that? And maybe better off, because examples are always good. Who's done it well? I always think of, whenever I look at anything sort of business-to-business communication, I always go over to GE, right, for their ability to take, and I know that they've done podcasting, complicated topics, distill it into something where it's a 5 or a 10-minute podcast, and you ultimately get some value out of it because they're good storytellers. Any others that you can think of, or how one ultimately should think about approaching this?
So just calling back to 2 paths. One path is it's podcast as company newsletter, right? I think that has merit, but you're not going to show up on the charts with that. But it can be a good supplement to your content strategy, your content marketing overall. If you're talking about the dozens or maybe even hundreds of shows that people have spent millions of dollars to create, whether it's Casper or Away or any of the brands that continue to do this, I have not run into anybody yet that goes, oh yeah, this was a huge win from an ROI standpoint. Now that there may be exceptions to this, I just don't know them. I think that the better way is to find shows like, there's things like Business Wars, there's things like Masters of Scale with Reid Hoffman, where they actually go deep into integrations that are much more content focused and much more about storytelling, but they live within the shows themselves that already have audiences. Because by the time you create your own, even if it's good, you also have to have a separate budget to spend just to promote and advertise to acquire listeners to come over and try your corporate podcast. It is almost never the right decision. And so I would say partner with people that already have an audience, leverage the trust that they have, and listen to them and work with them to make sure that any story that you're telling is told without the biases that can really crush a corporate one, unless you literally have decided you are going to create a wing of your company that is about content creation and that is its own siloed effort. Some people have done that, but that's a tremendous risk of resources, and you've really got to take a deep breath and get a lot of consultation before you do it.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Casper, right? I don't know. I stopped reading Van Winkle's, right, which is what was that? Their attempt
Right.
at an e-magazine on sleep. It didn't necessarily go through on that stuff. In other words, it's an awfully big ask to have a topic and do it that way. Better off to leverage and partner with somebody.
Precisely.
All right. Yeah. Well, Dan, I think we're fast approaching the top of the hour here. So again, I want to really thank you for sharing your insights today, and I want to thank Evan Hebe and Oracle, all of the Oracle NetSuite team for bringing you in and sharing those insights on a topic like this. Some final reminders again to our audience. If you want the slides from today, you'll find them in Event Resources. Excuse me. If you keep your eye out later today, about 3:30, 4 o'clock. We're going to send you a link to the on-demand version. And finally, of course, please check out the Adweek webinar calendar, www.adweek.com/webinars, in which you can check out what we've got coming up, and please sign up for an upcoming webinar. So again, I want to thank our speaker today, Dan Granger of Oxford Road, and also thank our sponsor, NetSuite. I want to thank our audience for taking time out of your busy day, and we look forward to seeing everyone at an upcoming Adweek webinar.